Yeah, quick little intro. I'm Asha for people that don't know me. Yeah, so to keep things moving forward, I just wanted to welcome Preeta, who's
Thanks.
our featured writer today, featured author. We're so happy to have you. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
joining
Thanks so much for inviting me.
us. Yes, awesome. Yeah, so just a quick little blurb I wanted to read out about Preeta. She has a lot to her name, but yeah, Preeta is a multi-award-winning Malaysian writer of fiction and nonfiction. Her first novel, Evening is the Whole Day, which is the one that we'll kind of discuss more at length today, it won the Hopwood Novel Award, was a finalist for the Commonwealth Writers Prize in 2009, and was longlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction. So this book has gotten a lot of accolades, and it's been translated in a lot of different countries. So Preeta's had that experience of coming out on the other side of I think what a lot of us are aiming for, which is kind of great experience to draw on. And also, maybe some of you know this, but Preeta and I share the distinction of having grown up in Malaysia, which is a country that isn't very represented in popular literature. But maybe that's a good place to start, actually, because Malaysia shows up as the setting for your first book, Preeta. So maybe you can kind of share a little bit about, where in Malaysia you grew up, and how you ended up in the U.S. and now living in the French countryside.
Sure, yeah. I was born in Batu Gajah, which is not even going to show up on any standard map of Malaysia, but it's a small town towards the north, I would say, of Peninsular Malaysia. And I grew up in Ipoh, which is a Chinese majority town. Um, um, I went to a missionary school, an all-girls school. I grew up in Malaysia and left. This was in the early 90s. I left, and it was a time, I think the 1980s and 90s were a time when most sort of middle-class minority kids tried to get out of Malaysia if they could. So either your parents could afford to send you abroad, or you tried to get a scholarship, which is what I did. I got a scholarship and I went to the US to an international school for 2 years. And then I stayed for my college education. And then I went to graduate school in the US, and then decided that I'd had enough of the US and left, and now I live in France. Yeah, so I think I had a pretty normal middle class upbringing in Malaysia. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But I'm also curious about, because I know a little bit about your background of how you started out studying something completely different
Mm-hmm.
before
Yeah,
getting started on your MFA or writing your novel.
that's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I come from a Malaysian Tamil family, and I have two older brothers. One of them studied engineering, the other one studied law, so it's kind of understood that I was going to study medicine because it's the triumvirate. Um, and that's actually what I thought I would do. Although I think from a very young age that wasn't really my passion. Like I could do science, but it wasn't ever what I really loved. But I sort of forced myself. I tried it, and even as far as I think my second year of undergraduate, that's as far as I got when I realized that it really wasn't what I wanted to do. Yeah. So yeah, until then, I was in science classes, in very serious, like hard
Mm-hmm.
science classes, but always sort of more interested in. I remember in boarding school, I would be doing the reading and homework of my friends who were studying history and literature. I would be helping them with their papers and doing their reading, and then sort of at the very last minute being like, oh shit, I have to write this lab report so I can drop it off tomorrow. So it's, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, my second year in university or college is when I decided that I wanted to sort of make a transition more towards the arts and humanities, but I took some literature classes. I ended up majoring in history and music because I also have a pretty long serious music background. And I thought, let's just try this. And then I went to graduate school, as you probably know, for music history, which I was thinking of. I mean, in retrospect, I remember I was talking to a friend one day about, by that point, I was already working on my first novel. And he said, and I was struggling with a lot of things in graduate school by that point, because I thought, I don't really want to teach university. I really love
Mm-hmm.
research and I really love reading, but I'm not sure I want to teach university, but I'm going to stick with this anyway because it seems safer. And my friend looked at me incredulously and said, wait, hang on a minute. Your fallback, your safe fallback is a PhD in musicology. You might want to rethink this. Like, if you want to stay fallback, do banking or something. And then I thought, okay, maybe if I'm going to do this, I really should just do what I love best and not try, not still try to have the safe backup that's anyway sort of far-fetched and ridiculous. And so at that point, I had finished everything for my music history doctorate except for the dissertation, and that's when I left. And I had part of a novel that wasn't very well developed yet, but I decided to apply for my MFA, and I went and finished the novel, and then here we are. Yeah.
And maybe you can kind of talk briefly about how the idea came to you for the novel, and sort of like how you generated that. Maybe give us a bit of a synopsis of the novel as well.
Yeah, sure. The novel is set in Malaysia in the 1980s. I wouldn't say, I mean, it's not autobiographical. It doesn't really draw on my own life in terms of the plot, but in terms of the feeling and the setting, obviously it draws on my childhood a great deal. And I think that growing up, when I used to write things that never really went anywhere growing up, and I think that I was always really interested in class and race. I think that when I was growing up, I was really interested in the relationship between families and their servants, because growing up middle class, most of my relatives, at least, we didn't really, but most of my relatives had live-in servants, and I sort of was very interested in that relationship, and used to experiment with that theme a lot. So the novel that I ended up writing is about a middle class family in Ipoh, which is my hometown, and they have 3 children. And the oldest daughter is the same age as their servant, as they call her, their servant girl. And it's a story about the family. It's a little bit of a mystery because it begins with the death of the grandmother, which we know is sort of, not a natural death, that something happened. And really, I would describe, I mean, the novel sort of begins with that event, which we already know has happened, and it moves backwards to reveal what really happened and why it happened. And people use this term more now. When I was first writing it, I hadn't heard it that much, but it's a why done it, as people say. It's, the sort of the motivating force behind it is not what happened, but why it happened. And it sort of moves backwards through the action of 1 year, but also the backstory to kind of lay out what's happened in this family. And yeah, does that?
Yeah, no, that's a great. I mean, having read your novels, that's a great synopsis of it. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a reading to kind of give us a taste.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
I know
sure.
not everyone has had an opportunity to read it yet, so that I think would be a nice.
Yeah, no problem. So I had chosen a few different passages, and I think I'll start. I mean, since I talked a little bit about how race and class are these, broad themes that I keep returning to, and that I think I'll probably always write about. Then, yeah. So I think I'll read a little bit that I think is quite pointed on the theme of race and class. Okay, where's it going to start? Hang on. Okay, so this part that I've chosen, is basically, it's a train journey that the mother in the novel is taking with her youngest child. They're going. The mother's pregnant, and she's taking the youngest. Oh, sorry, she's taking the oldest child. Sorry, I said youngest, but I meant she's taking the oldest daughter, who is her only child at that time. She's taking the older daughter to visit some relatives. I think that's all you need to know. It's a train journey. Let me see if there's anything else I should. Okay, yeah. And they're going from Ipoh, where the bulk of the novel is set, to the capital city of Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. Okay. The train drew in, giving a great metallic shudder at its own whistle. People put their fingers to their ears. Only 20 minutes late, Amma said. Almost nothing at all. Too efficient our great country's becoming, just like they promised us. Charging into the modern age. The inside of the train was all green. Green curtains, green seats, green doors leading to other cars. An antimacassar embroidered with the words Kereta Api Tanah Melayu lay delicately on each headrest. What does it mean, Amma? Uma said. Keretapi Tanah Melayu. Uma, don't start, snapped Amma. You know I don't know all that. I didn't study their wonderful Malay language in school. Anyway, I think it's something to do with the train only, nothing so great. But someone demurred, someone who wished at least to qualify this dismissive verdict of train only and nothing so great, and at most to, well, what that someone wanted at most, in the best of all possible worlds, is not yet relevant, not quite yet. For now, he, a Malay man, seated across the aisle and behind Uma and Amma, concentrated on correcting certain misconceptions. Hey, Tangchi, he called out softly, leaning sideways in his seat, his teeth yellow under the black velvet of his songkok. Tangchi! Tangchi meant little sister in Tamil, but Uma, 6 years old, in stockings and a smocked dress with a sash, knew two things without having to think about them. Number one, the Malay man didn't really speak Tamil. And number two, she wasn't anyone's little sister. I'm not Tangchi, she said, and by way of honest but friendly introduction, I'm Uma Rajasekaran. Only implied but keenly felt by all present. And who are you, audacious songkok wearer with yellow teeth? Said Amma, one hand flicking Uma's knee. Don't be rude. She shut her eyes against the green glare streaming through the curtains and leaned against the headrest. Oh, so sorry, La Tangchi, said the Malay man, but I tell you something, okay? Uma blinked at the man. Just above his left eyebrow, the velvet of his songkok had worn off to leave a pale, mangy spot. You're asking your poor mummy so many questions. I answer for you, can or not? A vendor was making his way through the train, his voice barely audible in the distance. Nasi lemak, nasi lemak, nasi lemak, curry pup. Nasi lemak, nasi lemak, nasi lemak, curry pup. Kereta api Tanah Melayu means railway, La Tangchi, the man went on. Means Malay Land Railway. Malay land, that means Malaysia, La Tangchi. That also you don't know, huh? Looking at me with your eyes so big, your own country also you don't know the name, is it? Ayo, yo, Tangchi, your own national language also tak tahu ke? No shame, are you? Living in Malay land but cannot speak Malay? Your mommy and daddy also no shame, living in Malay land and never teach their children Malay? Malay land? But this was magical and impossible, a mountainous land for giants and monsters and brave, sarong-clad heroes. Malay land was like Disneyland or Never Never Land, not a place where people spat into flower beds and farted in crowded railway stations and served too oily inchi kabin. To hear about Malay land, a land obviously hidden from the naked eye of the uninitiated, might be almost worth forgiving the Songkok wearer for saying Tangachi, for appropriating words to which he had no blood-given right, and which, moreover, were inaccurate. Perhaps even for his audacious no-shaming, which creased Uma's brow and burned her cheeks. My appa, she wished to inform the yellow-toothed man, is much cleverer than you, and he can talk proper English, not like you. But one did not say such things to grown-up strangers. I'll stop there. I can't hear you now. Oh, you're muted, okay.
Sorry.
No problem. Yeah.
There we go. That was amazing. Wow.
Thank you.
That was yeah, I mean it's like it's so interesting to because I've read your book but then have you read it because I feel like it was like just a lot of the stuff you said like being from Malaysia is like quite like triggering also like I mean in a good way but it's definitely something you know if you've lived in Malaysia you've probably had people say some version of that to you. And I do want to come back to a lot of that here. So a lot of your work specifically, both in fiction and nonfiction, seems to be very influenced by this idea of like race and class. And I think you're the one in previous discussions, like you, and I just want to bring up this quote really briefly. Like you sent me this James Baldwin quote, and I'm just going to read it out because it's perfect in itself. And essentially, James Baldwin says, every writer has only one story to tell, and he has to find a way of telling it until the meaning becomes clearer and clearer, until the story becomes at once more narrow and larger, more and more precise, more and more reverberating. And I just love that idea because I think when we've talked about it before, you basically mentioned like that writers generally fixate on one or two themes that
Mm-hmm.
tend to influence all of their body of work.
Mm-hmm.
And you have talked briefly about race and culture, but there's another element that also influences your work, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how all three intersect.
Sorry, what was the third element that you?
Like or like memory and
Oh,
time.
memory, right. Okay, yeah, time. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, I sometimes think that the two types of people in this world, people who sort of live in the present moment and are very much grounded in the present moment, and people who are always kind of looking back. And for me, the past is really very alive, like my own past, but also like globally, history. And so I think often when I've noticed also, like when any new thing that I write, I tend to have this sort of backward looking, even though I obviously can't do, I can't write every novel with this exact same backward structure, but that is um, I feel like I'm always sort of looking back. And I think that comes up a lot for me in anything that I write. I feel, yeah, sort of the presence of history. I know that these things are very closely intertwined for me, because when I talk about Malaysia, I'm often, there's a kind of how do I say this? There's a way in which I think everything that I write about Malaysia is imbued with this sense of what it could have or should have been, and that's I, it's not, I think that I don't consciously, more and more I write things that are set in the present, and so nothing that I would think of as historical fiction, but I think that history is sort of always underneath. And um, eh, be, I think that that idea of what Malaysia could have or should have been, of course, is the idea about race, about how race could have been
Mhm.
thought about differently, how very, in a very concrete way, we could have had different policies, we could have had a different constitution, which would have had so many. I mean, basically, we would be a different place now. And there's no way ever. Of course, history is not a game of what if. Like, you can never. That's not something that serious historians do. You can't really write a serious academic, work about what might have been. But so that's where I think that's probably where fiction comes in. It's kind of imagining, but in a
Mm,
serious and nuanced way. um, and I'm not just talking about speculative fiction. I'm talking about everything, sort of every that sense of loss. I think that sense of loss of a dream or a possibility being in everything I write. And then, yeah, so that has to do with the way that race and class work in Malaysia today. Sorry, that was a very convoluted, vague answer, but I
no,
hope that,
it's super
that it.
interesting. And I think in conversations with you, you've mentioned that this kind of thing, did it come pretty naturally to you? Like the fact that this race and class is something that like is always going to influence your work, or do you think that's something that people can kind of strive to discover over time? Like,
I think it's going to be different for each person, and I think that for me, I mean, I think this has a lot to do with power structures, and that if you uh, have never lived in the dominant majority, which is the case for me. Like, I've never, like, in my, what I consider my country, because I've only been, my ancestors are from India, but I've only been there twice as a tourist. I'm really not
mm-hmm,
from India. So I've never belonged to the dominant majority in any place that I've lived. I've never grown up. I didn't grow up feeling that sense of really, like, power and belonging, and then of course not in the US and not in France. And so I think that because of that, for me at least, I mean, I hesitate to speak for everyone, but I think that I think it's true. I think generally when you don't belong to the dominant majority, that you tend to see these things more, you tend to think about them more, about power structures and about um, sort of the role that race is playing in every interaction. You kind of always sense it in the room, I think, in a way that again, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think when you belong to the dominant majority, you have to train yourself if you want to. If you feel that it's beneficial to you or to society somehow, then you can train yourself to see it in the room. But it's something that doesn't come, as you said, naturally. It's not something that's sort of a part of you as you're growing up. Whereas I don't try to do it. I sometimes even
mm,
try not to do it. But sort of the first thing I always see, when I I don't know, like I'm on social media and I see a photo of someone's birthday party, the first thing I'm going to notice is everyone of the same race. Um,
Mm.
when I walk into a room, I'm always conscious, like, am I the only brown person here? It's not even, I mean, it's not even a sense of feeling actively threatened. It's not even necessarily always a bad thing. It's just an observation, and it's almost always the first observation that I make.
Yeah.
So then,
That,
you know, it follows naturally that when I write about the world in which we live, it's going to be there. It's going to be sort of the guiding force of a lot of things that I write.
yeah, I can definitely sort of empathize with that. And just, I think a lot of my work is, after you said that, I started thinking about it for myself. It's a lot of it is driven by this feeling of being the other.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that actually applies to more than just like race, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like if you talk about any kind of marginalized, like if you're, you know, woman with gender, or
Absolutely.
like, or even if you're not cisgender, right? Like, what is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
experience like?
Yeah.
Or
Absolutely.
anything
Sexuality. Yeah.
applies
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
across so many things. So
Yep.
yeah, this is really interesting. Um, but yeah, kind of actually coming back to the idea of like, you know, for those of us that write about things that aren't like the mainstream sort of like culture or
Mm-hmm.
narrative or place, one thing that you do really well in your books is sort of like talk about like, and I'm saying this about Malaysia, but it's like not a very like mainstream place in
Mm-hmm.
literature, and it's you definitely talk about events and power dynamics that are not well known. How do you balance between being authentic about the language you use and then making sure your reader has enough information to understand what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah, that's key. I think it's just enough information to stay invested in the narrative. But I try to always remember that it's not necessary for everyone to relate to the text on the same level. And when I was
Mm.
much younger, like when I was in my early 20s, I sort of went through this angry phase of, you know, we had to read all this colonial literature and we managed it. And so, you know, have a taste of your own medicine. But I don't think of it in that way anymore. Like, I don't think about it as revenge. I just think that actually, like, I've now read some texts as an outsider, obviously, which you do, you know, growing up. But then I've also read some things as an insider. And I think it's so enriching to have both those types of relationships, you know, to be able to have both those types of relationships. And really, why should the West never get to have that? Why should we always,
Mm.
you know, be explaining and catering? Because there's just something very, um, yeah, immersive and immediate about being able to be the fly on the wall. And I'm not going to explain it to you. You just get to be here, which you never, that's literally something that you cannot experience even as a tourist, you know, because when you
Mm.
travel to a place, especially now, you know, everything is, people are going to try to cater to you, to make you feel welcome, to explain to you. None of this is bad. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's a very rare experience to be just sort of dropped into a culture that's saying things to each other that are not for your ears, but you get to hear them anyway. You know, it's kind of this thing that, I mean, what do we say when no one's listening?
Mm.
But you get to listen. And I think that's such a useful thing to be able to provide. I don't know, you know, I think the only place to find that is in art, in literature, theater, maybe film. Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of what I always have in my mind. And so I think in terms of like how much I don't really, when I'm in the process of writing, I'm not really thinking like, oh, am I going to lose, you know, are people going to be lost? Do they, will they stop reading because they don't know what's happening? I don't really, I think that so much of what's happening, you know, we're all human beings. There's so much that's universal that when you're dropped into a scene or a room like that, you might feel sort of at sea for a few minutes, and then if you trust, then you find your feet again. And I think, yeah, for me, it's more about like establishing that trust at the very beginning of the book. Like, I'm here, I have an, you know, sort of the voice of authority. This is a story that I'm telling. And I think that if you pull people into the story enough, the rest, like, people don't really need to have everything explained to them. They will sort of trust. It's about trust. For me, it's about trusting the author and the authorial voice, and maybe the narrator's voice also.
Mm. That's
So
super
I think
interesting.
I don't do, I mean, less and less. even in the first book, I didn't really translate or italicize. Those were conscious choices. But then now more and more, I find myself just, I think some of the things that I subtly explained in the first book, I just wouldn't now. I think I would just leave it, because more and more I think also, if you really you feel you need to know, there's always the internet. It's so much easier to look things up than it was 40 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So you just focus on like a really good story and character development, and like people
Yes.
need to do the
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I kind of want to come back a little bit to what you said about trust, right? And the trust between like the author and the reader.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of talk about like writing, like you said, writing for your ideal reader. And you talk about this ideal reader, and then you talk about everyone else is, obviously invited to be experienced, to be part of the experience, but you write with an ideal reader in mind. Generally, most people do, even if they don't know it yet. How would you describe your ideal reader?
Pretty much someone like me. I think, yeah, someone who I mean, it's hard. I could say that I write for Malaysians, but it's a very tiny fraction of Malaysians who read fiction in English. So really, I mean, someone like me who thinks a lot about um, these themes in Malaysia, who thinks about race and who thinks about class, and who has read things but never really felt seen or mirrored by the things that they were reading that were set in other places. And so I remember growing up and sort of always looking and finding moments, of course, like I would read South Asian literature like Rushdie or Naipaul. There were moments when I would feel okay, that's something that's familiar. But yeah, I think I read for someone, and it's not necessarily, I mean, there's a lot of intersections. I think I write for a lot of different ideal readers. Some of them might be Malaysians who, like I said, think about race and class. Some of them might be people who think a lot about race and class, but are not Malaysian and are just interested globally in race and class. And, there's so many different, people who are just curious about history, or people who think a lot about time in the way I do. I think, I don't know, the ideal reader could be any of these people.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of intersections there, and it's like I think having your ideal reader is important. But my second question to you, which probably isn't going to be an easy one to answer, is then as a writer and as an author, you write a novel, and your goal is to get it published, or a short story, whatever it is. How do you think about the marketability of your piece, right? Or is that something you should think about? Should we not be doing that?
Well, I mean, I can't be too prescriptive about this, because some people choose to think about it and some people choose not to. And I think there's no right answer, because I don't want to, I don't think of people who think about it as sellouts, or that they're doing something that's, somehow something that I should look down upon, that serious artists can never think about marketability. I don't think that way. For me personally, it's not, I can't think about it when I'm writing, because I really just want to write the best story that I can write, and then worry about it later, which has not actually panned out so well for me for the second novel. So I think it's something, I don't know. I mean, I don't know at what level that what stage in the process that could enter if you chose to think about it. I don't know. I could see that maybe when you were thinking about, oh, I have some ideas for a novel and I wonder if I should pursue this one or that one, maybe you would look around you and see, oh, maybe see. But again, it's so hard to predict the market. Like, you could look around you and see, oh, this seems really popular right now, and maybe I'll try that because it seems like that's something people are interested in. But at the same time, should you instead be thinking, well, no one's looked at it from this angle, maybe I'll do something a bit different. I think you can end up getting lost in those questions of what other people want to read, and maybe in the end, what's best for you as a writer, and maybe what ends up being best for your readers as well, is just to stay, just to sort of, be true to your vision of what the book should be. But then, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you will come up against, I think, especially, we talked about this when you and I, were going over the talk earlier, sort of the idea that, some when you come from what I think of as the periphery, like if you're not from, a major Western country, but you're also not from a country that has had a long literary relationship with the West, like India, then it does become much harder. And one of the reasons it becomes much harder is because people aren't going to have, really, I'm talking about people. And increasingly, I feel like we should distinguish between the readers and the publishing industry, because it's really the publishing industry that kind of stands in the way of what, almost, I think, in the way of what readers might want. But at some point, you are going to come up against that, what the publishing industry thinks it's going to be able to sell. And I think when you come from the periphery, they're going to feel like people don't have enough background maybe for this narrative, or people, what if people are not interested in this? What if people can't get a foothold in this story that you want to tell, that is just so weird and out there, and also is from a peripheral country? So I don't know, those are things that I think, if you are able to write the book you want to write and also keep those questions in mind, then more power to you. But I'm not able to do that, or haven't been so far. Who knows?
It's not true. I mean, you definitely already have one successful book under your belt. So,
yeah.
But that's actually a good segue then to talk about your second book. I was wondering if you could do actually a quick reading from that one, so we can kind of get a little bit of a feel for
Yeah,
the
sure.
difference between the two.
Yeah, so since you mentioned that I did have success with the first book, and I think the first book was a much easier, I don't want to use the word pigeonhole, but I mean something along that spectrum. It was much easier to categorize. It was much easier to approach. It was a novel about an Indian family, and novels about ethnic Indian families, are quite popular, still are, were back then. The second novel is, first of all, not about an Indian family. It's not about a nuclear family. It's kind of strange in subject matter. And here, hang on, let me just find it. Sorry, hold on a second. Anyway, I'll try to summarize while I'm looking for it. It's a novel that's set again in Malaysia in the 1970s this time, and it's set in a utopian movement, like a cult, a pan-religious utopian cult. And the person who's telling the story is the son of the man who founded the cult. Now, I'll just take a minute and open the right document. Okay, so I've chosen the bit that I chose to read for you all is, it's not actually the beginning. It's a little bit further into the book, but it's actually the part where the narrator is introducing himself or talking about himself. And as I said, he's the son of a man who founded this cult. Okay, and the chapter is called Personal Particulars. Please print in black ink pen only. My name, for now that you know my parents' and brothers' names, it is time you made the acquaintance of the family's lower rung. My name is Clarence Kannan Cheng Ho Muhammad Yusuf Dragon. To those who know me well, I am Kanna, which in Tamil means not only beloved, but also I. Thus, I am, to those who know me well, the eye of the dragon. Of course, the registration clerk in Tanah Rata never approved my name. The man tapped his pen on the form like a woodpecker, like that, and said to my father, "You cannot have 25 names. You cannot be Christian and Hindu and Buddhist and Muslim at the same time. This is against the law." "Who says?" "What law?" said my father. The clerk dug his nose a bit, and thinking, he inhaled deeply, he exhaled slowly. My father could see that he was looking for excuses and ways to find fault. In short, anything that would allow him to teach this arrogant, don't know what race bugger in front of him a lesson. Leafing through the documents my father had brought, he found his next move. "First of all, I cannot put your name as the father if you don't show me your marriage certificate," he said. "Don't have certificate" means, "Okay then," my father said, "just leave that part blank." "Leave it blank? Leave it blank? So you mean your son will have no father?" "If he is my son, as you say yourself, then I am his father, isn't it?" The clerk shifted his weight from his left buttock to his right buttock. "Secondly," he said, "you cannot give your son this Muslim name, Muhammad Yusuf. Only Muslim can have Muslim name, and you're not Muslim. Am I right? Thirdly, there's only one God for all of us," my father said. He flashed the clerk a bright and saintly beam that lifted his eyebrows. He went on, "The same God, with different names. We're all Muslim. We're all Christian and Hindu and Buddhist also. I want to give my child one name from every Malaysian religion. That's all. Thirdly, you are already in the wrong. Yes or not? In the wrong, because here I see your wife's name Muslim, but you're not Muslim. Where's your Muslim name, please? Still smiling, my father bowed slightly and announced, like Raj Kapoor, like that, style only, my heart is Muslim. The clerk took off his spectacles and rubbed his pointer finger and his thumb in his two eyes. To this day, I do not know why then and there he did not call up some big boss or other to come and question my father some more. I got only one guess, and that is that he had taken too much sambal with his breakfast nasi lemak and needed to run for the jamban. In his head, he was already picturing the peeling white painted door with that glorious red word on it, Tandas. Oh, you can laugh and say my mind is literally in the shithouse, but I spent the greater part of my life studying them. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, the lesser Malaysian government department desk clerk, and I know them, front to back, inside out, upside down, with all the tea breaking and coffee making that they did in those milk-fed UMNO days, with the vast amounts of oily goreng pisang and ubi and chempedak they consumed daily. Is it any surprise that they were plagued by irregular bowels? Our clerk winced and decided that sooner or later somebody else would find out about this fool and his heretic wife anyway, so why should he be the one to stick his neck out? Okay, fine, mister, he said. Why don't you just choose a Hindu name and a Christian name and stop there? Hindu and Christian is okay. Biasa aja, yes or not? Nobody will look you macam you dah gila. Why should I care how people look at me? My father said. The only thing that matters is that I am doing what is right. I'll stop there.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Again, I just like all the feels transported home.
Anyway, as you can see, it's very different, and in some ways a much denser kind of narrative. And anyway, yeah. So talking about marketability, it has not so far proved itself to be very marketable.
Maybe you can actually briefly explain to everyone else as well, sort of like some of the reactions you've gotten to this novel that were interesting to you from some of the publishing houses. Because you work with an agent, and your agent's been shopping it out to the larger publishing houses.
That's right. Yeah, she started out with the larger publishing houses. My agent is in the US, although she has co-agents in other countries, but she started out shipping it. I mean, yeah, shopping it out in the US. And she started, of course, everyone does, with the larger publishing houses. And some of the responses we got, I mean, basically, there's a lot of kind of, this feels very unfamiliar, but there's a sense of you can't, if the setting is already so unfamiliar, then you can't also make the style so unfamiliar. And that's something that keeps coming up again and again. Like, you have to choose. If you are from a weird country already, then can you please just stick with one kind of weirdness and not also all these other kinds of weirdness? And I think there's a lot of, I mean, the book is basically, the narrative voice is, he's someone who's quite estranged from himself. He's emotionally distant, which I think, it's quite a challenge to write an emotionally distant character that the reader feels invested in. But it's a conscious choice on my part. Like, I wanted to be able to write this kind of character, and that's something I think which would already be a little bit distancing. But the fact that it's a emotionally distant reader who is not from the West, it's kind of two strikes against him. And so something that has kept coming up again and again is, we can't relate. Basically, it's different ways of saying we don't feel emotionally connected to this voice. It's really, people say, the prose is wonderful, it's got a lot of energy, it's very ambitious, many great things about it, but we just can't connect to this voice. And that's when, I mean, my agent, who is herself an immigrant in the US and a woman of color, she had this realization that of course you're not going to be able to relate, because you all are from the same background. And the publishing industry in the US is still, especially in the beginning, when it was the major publishing houses that she was sending it out to, the background of the editors is very, very similar. They're all sort of a certain age group. They're all 90% white. They've all gone to the same liberal arts colleges in the Northwest. And so even though, I mean, they're good people, I'm not saying, and they believe in diversity, and they really believe that they want diverse voices. But the fact is, that the only way to really get diverse voices is to diversify the gatekeepers. You cannot, I mean, you will all, and it would be the same if it were a group of Malaysians. We would all, in ways that we don't even realize, be culturally conditioned to expect certain things and to connect with certain things, to connect with certain experiences on an emotional level that other people from outside our culture wouldn't be able to connect with. And so really the only, because it's such a subjective field, it's not, it's not maths or physics, it's something where it's really so much about the feel. Like, I got this, I really like the story. I think all the more reason it really needs opening up of the space to gatekeepers who are from other cultures, other places, other backgrounds. Yeah.
Yeah. And you, to kind of follow along the same lines, you mentioned something about how when a book lands, on the desk of a publisher, the need to be able to compare it to something else.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this whole, which was kind of a revelation to me when I first found out, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I didn't, this isn't something I learned, even going through my MFA or anything, but there's this whole concept of comps, which means that when a book lands on the desk of an editor and the editor really likes the book, the way that they convince the publishing house, at least I'm talking about major houses, maybe this is different in a very small independent publishing company, but in a major house, the way that they convince the house to acquire the book is to be able to compare it to other existing books. And this is the whole process of comps. And so if you can't compare, and ideally you compare it to like books that have sold really well, and you say, this is the next, and then they will buy it, which of course, when as a reader, not even leaving aside how I felt about it as a writer, but as a reader finding that out, I was really sort of like, I don't want to actually be reading the same things over and over again that can all be compared to each other. And I sort of felt resentful, like, would they just get out of the way and let me read these other things that writers are writing that can't be compared to anything else? And maybe some of them are bad, but maybe some of them are really good, and we'll never know. I just felt really cheated as a reader. Yeah, so anyway, that's just, I think that's just how the industry has worked for a very long time now. And I don't see any signs of it changing, especially I think, if anything, as the economy is not doing so well now, and it's going to make the industry more and more risk averse, I think. And the publishing industry is, I think, notoriously risk averse anyway. I don't know why, because they have all these like fallback safe, they have like the big best-selling coffee table books and the I don't know, the ghost-written books by politicians and all these things that you would think would be their cash cows and they could take the risk, but it's not very risk averse.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think then how does that compare, right? So I think a lot of what you're talking about so far is with the larger publishing houses. So then, like, what would be sort of the benefit of maybe trying to go with a smaller publishing house?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're trying now. And I think there, obviously there are pros and cons, and the big con, of course, is that you will get a lot less money. And the smaller publishing houses they give the author a smaller advance, which is one part of it, but they have a lot less money to spend on publicity and distribution, which is changing. I mean, now they're still considered independent houses, but you're hearing about them more, and there's sort of like there's a whole tier system, I think, even in independent publishing houses, where some of them are now becoming sort of more established and people have heard them because their books have won prizes. So there's that as well. But I think there's less money, and they're going to have less money to, like, I don't know, take out a full page ad in the London Book Review or the New York Times. That's not going to happen from a small publishing house. But there are some really significant advantages as well, and one is that they acquire many fewer authors, and so each author gets a lot more attention. And it's sort of this, I think, from what I understand, I mean, I haven't experienced it yet because my first book was with a big publisher, but from what I've heard, it's sort of this more old-fashioned relationship between the editor and the author. What we used to hear about in the old days, where your editor was like really your friend. It was a collaboration. You talked about the book. You had these long conversations, and you got to know each other quite well over the course of working on your book. I think that's still possible in the smaller houses. Of course, because they acquire fewer authors and each one gets a lot more attention, they don't have 700 books that they're choosing from when it comes to nominating a book for the major prizes. They have 5 books, and probably each of those books will be they will be their nomination for a prize. Probably they will, I mean, they don't have this vast list and that they're going down and saying, okay, we're gonna send the A-list author as our nomination once again. It's going to be Rushdie this year, like it was, every year that he came out with a book. No, it's going to be one of these few authors that they've acquired, which isn't to say that you'll win the prize, but at least you're there on the list, on the long list or the list of submissions. So those are what I would think of as the pros and cons.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never heard about that sort of like the pros side of going with a smaller press, but it's definitely something to consider. And also, like, I do think they kind of, from what I've seen, publish more diverse voices. They're more open to that.
Yes. Yeah. It's quite obvious, actually. Yeah. The small presses are where all the writers of color are. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, no worries. We have actually just 5 more minutes before we open it up to the Q&A, but I wanted to maybe ask you to read one more time. People have really been enjoying your readings.
Sure.
And I think we missed having one reading in there. So anything you'd like to read from?
Sure. Yeah. I guess I had another passage picked from, what was it that what was this meaning to illustrate? I had another passage picked from the first book, From Evening is the Whole Day, and I think. Oh, right. Okay. I think what we had talked about, one of the things we had talked about earlier was sort of this idea of how much, well, we did talk about it even today, how much do you explain and how much do you trust the reader? I think that's why I chose this passage. Maybe? I'm not even sure, but I'll just read it. We'll talk about it after. I'm trying to figure out okay. So this is sort of about, it's halfway through the book actually, and it's a passage when the family has decided to, something bad has happened. The grandmother has died, which you find out early on in the book, and they've decided to get rid of their servant girl. Okay. I don't know what I was thinking, Amma says at the breakfast table with a child's sweep of flat palm against wet cheek. After everyone warned me how difficult it is to find trustworthy servants these days. I told you, you should have gotten rid of the bloody girl after that first incident itself, Appa replies. After that mess with my great hero of a brother. Don't you think we should inform the police? Amma says once more. This type of mad woman will just turn around and do the same thing to someone else if we let her go free. But Appa's bravado has abated, never to be recovered on this particular subject. The longer his apoplectic rage echoes between his ears, the more certain his impression is that he has somehow, although there's no denying Chalam's brutish crime, made a fool of himself. That he should have been the bigger person, kept his temper in check, calmly given Chalam a month's notice so that she could go through the motions of looking for another job. Of course, she'd never get a job in anyone else's house after this. Every bloody Indian family in the country must already know what she's done. Just leave it to the gorgon across the street. But she could have looked for a factory job or a cleaner's position in some office building, something to satisfy her father, because let's face it, all the man will care about is his monthly toddy money, not his daughter's doubtful morals. If she could be seamlessly transplanted from this house to some other job, she'd be safe from what? What will become of her in her father's house? That's not my problem, Appa tries to tell himself. I can't bear the whole world's woes on my shoulders. Blast the troublesome contradictory voice that retorts, oh, weren't you going to fix the whole world's woes? What happened to your big dreams, Raju? What kind of socialist hires a drunk tapper's daughter and pays her nothing? He tries to defend himself. But you see, I wasn't paying her nothing. The money simply went to her father, who needed it just as badly, if not more. What with those 6, 7, 8, however many children waiting at home, I was only choosing to treat the problem at its source. Don't you see? If the head of the household has a little more money, doesn't it benefit everyone instead of just, shut up your mouth, you bastard, says the other voice in his head. It's a real rowdy, this voice. A lorry driver, a mama stall loafer with an open-chested shirt and a gold chain. It has none of Appa's refinements. Who do you think you're fooling? You paid off her father because you're a bloody pondan, a coward, too scared to stand up for an 18-year-old girl, some revolutionary you would have made. So once again, he dissuades Amma from her apparent quest for justice, which everyone but Amma knows to be, in truth, a hunger for revenge. Don't be silly, he says evenly. You call in the police and the whole thing immediately becomes a front page scandal. You want your face and your children's faces in the newspaper for everyone to see? Amma starts to sob quietly, hiding her nose in the tasseled pallu of her sari. Perhaps she really is crying. I'll stop there.
And so he asked, how long did you look for an agent? And did they want you to make any changes or edits to the book?
How long did I look for an agent? So because I went and got my MFA, there were agents who visited, the program, and they would often, you would submit things to them. And my agent, so I wasn't actually consciously looking for an agent at that time, because I had always thought that I would finish the book and then move on to that step, that I would cross that bridge when I came to it, sort of thing. But she read, I don't think it was a full draft. I think I still hadn't written the ending or something like that. It was very much close, very, very close to the end, but she read it and was really interested in it. And my agent, I think she was an editor, and at the time was a new agent. She had just left publishing. She didn't want to be an editor anymore, and she was just transitioning into being an agent. So we sort of found each other at a similar phase in our career, I would think, similar phase in our development. What was the second half of the question? How long did it take me to find the agent? And
did they want to make any changes
yeah,
or
so
edits?
one of the things that I was very lucky with is that my agent, as I said, is not, she works in New York, but she's not American. She's a mixed race person. And so she really gets my work in a way that I think afterwards, talking to other writers of color and other sort of immigrant writers in the US, I realized how lucky I was, because it's really the relationship that I have, or I should say, no, the relationship that she has with my work is actually very rare. Like, she completely gets it. And with this novel that I've had trouble selling, like, she really is able to I don't know, just put her finger on what's going on. She just really sees what's happening. And so in terms of making changes, I think the way that she approaches it, she always sort of leaves the final choice to me. With the first novel, no, we made hardly any changes, because I think she felt, well, we only sent it out to like 3 people. That it had such a different experience with that novel, because it sold very quickly after being sent out to only 3 people. But with the second novel, I mean, we've gone through so many, and so the way that she puts it is, let's try it this way. Let's see what happens. It's unlikely that anyone's going to go for it, because it's massive, it's too long, nobody's, she accurately predicted some of what would happen, but she's always willing to try it first, because you never know, like, someone might, and then with the comments that come in, she generally asks me, like, would you be comfortable making this change, or would you consider doing this? And if I say no, then it's a no. But if I say, yeah, maybe I'll try it, then but I think for the most part, she, having been an editor herself, like, I think she doesn't see that as her place as an agent so much. She would really like that to happen with an editor. And that's something that we both have been struggling with, is that as the industry, I mean, I think more and more, like, editors, and maybe this is something that will change now, but more and more for the last 10 years or so, editors want to acquire a finished book, and they don't really want to have, they don't really want to do that in the major publishing houses. They don't want to have that sort of collaborative process. So, like, a few comments that I got from editors were things like, it's really great, it has a lot of potential, but it needs editing. Like, isn't that your job description? Like, isn't that what you're for? But no. So yeah, I think she's always been like, that's why I left editing. That's going to be for someone else to do. And the kinds of suggestions that she makes to me are more like, very minor, or, maybe this might work if you did this, but it's very open-ended. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Preeta. This was super informative, I think, for a lot of people. And I just want to kind of end it on the note of thanking Preeta, but also letting everyone know that you can purchase her book, and Preeta would actually prefer that you do so from your local bookstore. She wants a good idea to support local bookstores. We all should. So we won't be sending around a link for that necessarily, but we will send a recap email with a link to a few things that we've talked about here, maybe some articles that Preeta has mentioned, and also some of her short stories, like fiction and nonfiction. But yeah, thanks to everyone for attending. This has been
thanks so much for having me. It was really fun.
Thank
you very much.
Great.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for the great questions
so much
for showing up.